Montana Territory, July 1877. The sun had barely risen when Olive Whitlow stepped down from the rusted train car onto the cracked wooden platform of a nameless town near the Bitterroot Range, her hands trembling under the weight of her carpetbag and the bruises still fresh on her arms. She looked both ways, heart hammering, waiting to hear if anyone had followed. But the only sound was the wind skittering dust across the tracks and the distant call of a raven. Her husband was over 200 miles behind her in Billings, and for the first time in 5 years he did not know where she was. Olive swallowed hard, her throat dry and raw. She had no money left, no home, and no plan, but she had freedom, and that had to count for something. A horse snorted behind her. She turned fast, startled, and saw a man dismounting from a tall chestnut gelding. He had a rifle slung across his back and dust on his boots like he had not stopped moving in days. His shirt was open at the throat, sleeves rolled up, hands calloused. He looked too young to carry that much wear in his face, but it was there around the eyes, in the way he scanned the space like he expected trouble. He noticed her watching and nodded once. "You lost." "No," Olive said quickly. Then softer, maybe a little. He adjusted his saddlebag and stepped closer, squinting against the sun. "You waiting on someone?" "No," she said again, her voice cracked. He noticed. "You all right?" "I will be." He paused, studying her. "Name's Merritt Oslen." "Olive Whitlow." He offered his hand and she hesitated before shaking it. His grip was warm, firm. He looked at her longer than most men would, not with interest but with concern. "You hungry?" he asked. She had not eaten since the night before. "Yes." "Come on then. I know a quiet place. I will ride slow so you can walk alongside." Olive followed him out of the town and down a side trail that led through tall grass and pine groves. They reached a stream an hour later, and Merritt unsaddled his horse, tied it to a low-hanging branch, and started a small fire. He handed her a strip of jerky and a hard biscuit. She ate like she had not seen food in days. Maybe she had not. "You running from something?" he asked gently. Olive met his eyes. "Someone," he nodded like he understood. "Me too." They sat in silence for a while. The breeze stirred her hair and she tucked a strand behind her ear. The bruises on her wrist peeked out from her sleeve. Merritt saw but said nothing. "You mind if I stay with you, just for a little while?" she asked. "I will figure something out once I get my feet under me." "Yeah," he said without hesitation. "You can ride with me. I do not ask questions you are not ready to answer." They traveled together for the next few days, moving westward into the hills. Merritt had a quiet way about him, steady, kind, never pushing too hard. He helped her mount the horse without complaint and made camp with care. When she winced from her ribs, he turned away to give her privacy. When she cried one night without a sound, he kept the fire going and sat nearby, just close enough to be felt. Olive was not sure when she started to trust him. Maybe it was when he handed her the reins one morning and said, "She is yours for the day," like she had earned it. Maybe it was when he taught her how to use his rifle, showing her how to brace her shoulder without touching her once. They crossed into Idaho Territory by the end of the week. It was wilder out here, less law, fewer eyes. Merritt said he was heading nowhere in particular, and Olive said that suited her just fine. One night, under a low sky full of stars, she finally told him the whole truth. "My husband's name was Walter. He was a banker, respected, polished, cruel. First year was all right, then he started drinking. Started making me feel like the dust under his boots. By the 3rd year, I stopped hoping for kindness and started hoping he would just forget I was in the room." Merritt's jaw tightened, but he stayed quiet. He said I was barren, that I was useless, I wanted children, I wanted a family. He said no one would ever want a woman like me, so I left. She looked at him then, eyes searching his face. "I did not even take a coat, just ran." Merritt leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You are not useless," he said, voice low. "You are strong. Braver than anyone I know." She blinked hard, but the tears still came. He reached over, slow and careful, and took her hand. "And you deserve better. You hear me?" Olive nodded, unable to speak. They did not kiss that night, but something shifted between them. A tether, a spark, something real. The next morning, Merritt surprised her with a bundle of wildflowers he had picked near the creek. "For you," he said, clearing his throat like he was not used to saying things like that. Olive smiled, holding them to her chest. "Thank you." They rode side by side, closer now. She laughed more. He did too. He showed her how to track deer, how to read the sky for storms. She told him about the books she used to read before the world turned gray. One afternoon, he told her why he had left home. My father ran a cattle ranch down near Laramie. I was set to take it over. But I could not stand the way he treated the hands, the way he treated my mother. I walked out last winter and never looked back. You ever regret it? She asked. No, he said, eyes on the horizon. Not once. They reached a small homestead near the Salmon River, abandoned but sturdy. Merritt fixed the roof, patched the door, dug a small garden plot out back. Olive cleaned the inside, found old cloth to cover the windows, made the place feel like something more than a stop along the way. One night, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip low across the valley, Olive turned to him. I do not feel afraid anymore. Merritt looked over and his face softened. Good, you should never have had to. Her heart pounded. I feel safe with you, she said. He reached for her hand. I feel the same. She leaned in, and their lips met, gentle at first, then deeper, full of something that had been building for days, maybe weeks. When they pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers, both of them breathing fast. I think I am falling in love with you, she whispered. Merritt smiled, and this time it was wide and sure. You are not alone in that, she laughed, and he kissed her again. And this time it felt like the start of something neither of them ever thought they would have, a new life, a brighter horizon, together. The valley shifted with August amber grass, swayed longer, slower, and the cottonwoods along the edge of the Salmon River turned a deeper green. The homestead had begun to settle around them, as if it too were relieved to finally be filled with quiet hands and steadier hearts. Merritt was mending a section of fence near the corral when Olive came up behind him with a tin cup of cool spring water. He brushed the sweat from his brow, leaned his weight on the post, and took the cup with a grateful nod. I found a book, she said, glancing toward the house. It was wedged behind the stove, water damaged, but pages are mostly good. He took a slow sip. What kind? A French grammar. He raised a brow. You speak French enough to read a letter if it's short and polite. She folded her arms, smiling faintly. I used to teach girls back in Hannibal, before I married. He looked at her longer than he needed to. You were a teacher, briefly. It didn't pay much, but it felt worth something. I liked their questions, how they asked about the world like it was still open to them. He set the cup down on a nearby rail. You ever think about teaching again? I don't know. Feels like another life, but maybe. Her gaze drifted across the hills. If I stayed somewhere long enough. Merritt pressed the nail he'd been holding into the wood and tapped it twice, not hard enough to drive it yet. You could stay here. She didn't answer right away. The wind picked up, brushing her skirts against her legs. He straightened, let the hammer rest by his side. I'm not saying it has to be now, he added, but if you wanted a place to belong again, I'd want that place to be here. Olive watched the river glint under the sun, its edges soft with silt and willow. I don't know how to make a life that isn't borrowed. I've only ever lived in someone else's house, under someone else's rules. This wouldn't be that. No, it wouldn't. They stood without speaking, and the quiet didn't press this time, it gave room. Later that evening, Merritt brought down an old wooden crate from the loft above the barn. Olive was peeling apples by the fire when he set it beside her. What's this? Things from my mother. I'd meant to leave them behind, but I couldn't. She wiped her hands and lifted the crate's lid. Inside were folded linens, yellowed letters tied with twine, and a small carved box. She opened it carefully. Inside lay a pair of silver hair combs shaped like leaves. She wore those to gatherings, Merritt said. Said they made her feel like herself again. Olive touched one, thumb grazing the edge. They're beautiful. They're yours if you want them, her breath caught. I couldn't. You could, and I'd like you to. She took one, turned it in her fingers. Why are you giving them to me? He crouched beside her, meeting her eyes. Because when I look at you, I see someone who's still choosing to live, even when it's hard. My mother was like that. Olive didn't speak. She slid one comb into her hair, then the other, the curve of them fitting as if they'd always been meant for her. Merritt stood slowly. That garden you started, it's coming in strong. I saw green beans pushing through this morning. She smiled then, quiet and sure. I think it likes being looked after, he nodded, then hesitated. I'd like to build a henhouse, maybe trade for some pullets at the next settlement. Would we keep them near the river bend? Could. That slope stays dry even after rain. Then let's do it. Evening deepened and they sat on the porch again, this time side by side on the bench Merritt had built from leftover pine. He handed her a folded scrap of paper, edges worn soft. What's this? Map of the land around us. Drew it myself. Thought maybe we could mark what we plant, where the deer trail runs through, that sort of thing. She unfolded it. You're thinking long term. I am. She traced a finger along the sketch of the river. I never thought I'd settle again. I didn't think I was allowed to. You are, you always were. Crickets started up in the brush, their rhythm steady. Olive leaned her head against his shoulder. I'd like to build something here, with you. He laid his hand over hers. Then we will. Inside, the fire burned low, casting flickers across the floorboards. The home smelled of apples and pine soap, and outside, the stars came out slowly, like they'd waited for the right night to show themselves. Neither of them moved. There was no need. The world could turn, and they'd stay right there, two people learning how to begin without fear, in a place shaped by their own hands. By mid-September, the mornings had turned sharp enough to draw breath through the teeth. Frost crept in at the corners of the windows before dawn, and Olive began laying an extra quilt across their bed each night. Chickens scratched the ground near the garden, and Merritt had started carrying in wood before supper, stacking it neat beside the stove. He came in one afternoon with a splinter in his palm, blood beading just beneath the skin. Olive was kneading dough, flour dusting her arms to the elbow. Fence rail cracked on me, he said, holding his hand out. She wiped her hands on her apron and took his wrist gently. Sit. He lowered himself onto the stool as she fetched the wash basin. She poured warm water over his palm, thumb steady despite the tremble just beneath her breastbone. It had become harder to keep her feelings quiet. He had a way of listening without watching, of giving her silence that didn't feel empty. You've been favoring that shoulder again, she said, eyes on the splinter as she eased it free. Old injury. Caught a bronc wrong when I was 17. Never healed clean. You should have said something. No use complaining, it's just bone remembering what it's been through. She dabbed the wound dry and wrapped it in clean linen. Still, you don't have to grit your teeth through everything. He flexed his fingers, then caught her gaze. Neither do you. She stepped back, heart beating fast in her throat. I'm not. Not anymore. Later that night, she found him outside beneath the cottonwoods, hammer resting at his feet, eyes turned toward the dark ridge where the moon was rising. She brought him a tin of coffee and sat beside him on the bench he'd dragged out there after supper. There's someone I should tell you about, he said, voice low, her hands tightened around the tin. All right. I had a brother, James, older by 2 years. He took the worst of Pa's temper, shielded me from most of it. When he turned 20, he left for Virginia City, said he'd seen enough of cattle and fists. She waited. He wrote me once, said he found work at a freight company, like the mountains better than the plains. Then he stopped writing. No one heard from him again. I'm sorry, Merritt shook his head. I've carried guilt about it. I was supposed to go with him, he asked, but I stayed. Thought I owed the ranch something. By the time I changed my mind, he was gone. You were just a boy. I was old enough to know better than to let someone I loved walk alone. Olive reached across the space between them and touched his knee. You're not alone now. He looked at her slowly, as though weighing something he hadn't dared hope. Neither are you. She nodded, and they sat in the cooling dark, the only sound the soft shift of wind through dry leaves above them. 2 days later, a trader rode up the path from the south, lean-faced and wind-chapped, leading a pack mule heavy with sacks and tools. Olive was stacking firewood when she saw him, and Merritt stepped out from the barn, rifle resting across his arm but pointed low. Looking to trade, the man said, reining in his horse. Got seed, salt, and a few tins of tobacco if either of you take to that. Merritt nodded toward the shed. We've got apples, cured meat, and lard. Might be worth a look. While Merritt bartered, Olive sorted through the seed pouches. She found one marked with faded ink, summer squash. Her fingers tightened around it. You plantin' for next year already? the trader asked. Planning to, she said. He studied her a second longer than she liked, then tipped his hat and turned to Merritt. You folks alone out here? Merritt's expression didn't change. We're enough. The trader didn't press. He took his trade and rode on, and Merritt watched until the man passed the ridge. That night, Olive brought the seed sack to the table. I want a real garden next spring, she said. Not just a patch, a full stretch. Beans, beets, cucumbers, squash, maybe even melons if the soil holds. Merritt leaned back in his chair. We'll need better tools. I can write to a supplier if we get to town before snow, he nodded. I'll build a fence around it. Keep the deer out, she smiled, and I'll keep the chickens from digging up the roots. His hand found hers across the table. It's good to look ahead. I used to be afraid of that. Not anymore, she shook her head. Not with you. They spent the next weeks preparing stacking hay in the loft, sealing the root cellar, laying kindling close to the hearth. Merritt repaired the window panes with oiled paper where the glass had cracked, and Olive dried herbs on the rafters until the house smelled of thyme and sweet bay. One evening, after supper, she pulled a small bundle from beneath the bed, a dress she'd found folded in a trunk when they first arrived, deep plum with a high collar and delicate stitching along the sleeves. She'd washed and mended it in secret. When she stepped into the main room wearing it, Merritt looked up from the fire and stood without a word. I wanted to feel like myself again, she said, brushing her hands down the skirt. You do, he said softly. More than ever. He held out his hand and she took it. They danced slowly without music, the fire crackling low as their only rhythm. His hand settled at her waist, hers at his shoulder, and they moved as if they'd done it 100 times. When they finally stopped, she didn't step back. Instead, she leaned close, her voice barely above a whisper. I love you. He touched her cheek, his thumb brushing her temple. I've loved you every day since that morning at the station. She kissed him then, full and certain. Outside, the wind hummed through the trees and the stars blinked awake, quiet witnesses to the beginning of something lasting. Inside, two people stood in the glow of firelight, no longer running, no longer afraid, just building something steady and real and wholly theirs. By late October, the first snow came light and early, blowing thin across the valley floor and clinging to the tops of the cottonwoods like a whisper. The frost stayed past morning, and the garden rose lay bare and turned in. In the mornings, Olive would wrap herself in Merritt's old wool coat and haul water from the creek while he split logs out back, breath clouding the air between them like smoke. They'd settled into the rhythm of the land without speaking about it. He watched the elk trails now, and she stitched wool liners into their gloves at night. The silence they shared had changed. It wasn't a hiding place anymore, but something they both leaned into, comfortable and full. One morning after a stretch of clear days, Merritt returned from checking the trapline with a length of folded canvas in his arms and something else in his eyes, an edge of thought he hadn't worn before. I crossed a clearing up near the ridge, he said, as he set the bundle on the table. There's a cabin there, burned out, half rotted, but the stone foundation's sound. Didn't look like anyone's used it in years. Olive wiped her hands on her apron and moved closer. You thinking of fixing it? No, thinking it might be old army ground. There were rusted tins and broken belt buckles near the edge. She studied his face. Does that mean trouble? Not yet. But we're close enough to the Nez Perce Trail that someone might ride through. I don't like not knowing who. She set the kettle on and poured water into the tin basin. What should we do? I want to ride north. There's a post station near the river fork 3 days if the weather holds. I can ask around, see if anyone's been through. Olive stirred the coals, watching the flames shift. You shouldn't go alone. I won't be gone long. She didn't answer right away. Then, setting the poker aside, she said, I've come to count on you being here. He stepped closer, resting a hand on the small of her back. I'll come back. Always. She leaned into him, her forehead against his chest. Promise me. I do. He left the next morning, wrapped in his oilskin coat with a rifle tied behind the saddle and 3 days' worth of cornmeal and dried meat strapped to the pack mule. Olive stood by the porch with his scarf in hand, watching until he disappeared beyond the ridge. The days passed slow. She kept busy rendering tallow, mending the stovepipe, checking the chicken coop before dusk, but the house felt still in a way it hadn't before. The fire burned lower at night, and she found herself reading aloud just to hear a voice in the room. It snowed again on the second night. Olive lay awake listening to the wind scrape against the windows, her palm resting on the empty side of the bed. By the fourth afternoon, hoofbeats cracked over the hard ground, slow and even. She stepped out with a shawl wrapped high over her throat, heart skipping until she saw him leading the mule, his hat pulled low and face shadowed from the cold. She ran to meet him, boots crunching over old frost. He caught her against him with both arms, burying his face in her hair. "You all right?" she asked, breathless. "I am now." Inside, while she poured hot tea and set a bowl of rabbit stew before him, he pulled out a folded paper from his coat and laid it on the table. "Guy at the post said there's been army movement farther west, but nothing near us. The cabin's likely just a leftover from some old patrol. No one's used it in years. Still, I thought we ought to know." She traced the edge of the paper, then looked up at him. "Thank you, Merritt." His eyes held hers. "I don't want anything creeping up on us. We've built something here." She reached over and placed her hand on his. "We have." That night, he brought in another load of wood and set the latch on the door tight before sitting beside her near the hearth. She was darning a hole in one of their blankets with slow, even stitches. "I saw a woman at the post," he said after a long pause. "She was traveling west with a wagon team, had a little boy with her. She said she lost her husband outside of Boise last year." Olive didn't look up. "She asked me if I had a family. I told her I did." Now she met his gaze. "You said that?" "I did, because I do. You're mine, Olive." The firelight caught the curve of her cheek, and she set the needle down carefully. "I never thought I'd be someone's again." "Not in a way that felt like a choice. You are, and not because I saved you or because we share a roof, because you're the strongest thing I've ever known, and I want to build the rest of my life around that." She moved to rest beside him, her head against his shoulder, fingers curling over his. "I want a child," she said quietly. "I don't know if I can have one, but I want to try." He was silent for a moment, then kissed the top of her head. "Then we'll try." Outside, the snow thickened in the dark, coating the roof in soft weight. Inside, the fire glowed steady, and the house, once hollow and wind-worn, held the warmth of two hearts that had chosen each other through fear, through silence, through the long labor of building trust. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. The words had been said, and they would hold. The first hard snow came just after the last of the onions were hung to dry in the lean-to. It fell fast and thick, blanketing the valley in silence. For 3 days, the world beyond the homestead disappeared in white, and Merritt and Olive moved around the house in wool socks and low voices, as though even their speech might shake the snow loose from the sky. One morning, as Merritt was shaving at the basin near the window, Olive stood behind him with her hands folded in front of her. He watched her in the reflection, noting the way her fingers pressed together, knuckles pale. "There's something I'd like to ask," she said. He set the razor down and turned. "Go on," her eyes didn't waver. "If we were to marry, I'd want it to be here, just us. No preacher, no paper. I've had a church wedding before. It didn't make it true." Merritt stepped toward her, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Then we'll marry by our own word. That's what makes it true anyway." She nodded, the tightness in her shoulders softening. They spoke no more of it that day, but the next morning, before the sun had crested the ridge, Merritt took 2 strips of leather from the drawer where he kept his tools. He shaped them into matching bands, knotting them with care. When he returned to the house, he found Olive standing at the hearth, brushing her hair. He held one band out to her. "Will you wear this, as a sign you belong nowhere but here?" She took it, her hand steady. "Only if you wear yours for the same reason." He smiled and slipped hers over her finger. She did the same. No vows were spoken beyond that. None needed to be. The days shortened. Merritt carved a cradle from leftover pine and lined it with wool sacks. Olive began sewing small garments from the muslin she'd tucked away in the root cellar. They didn't speak of hopes or fears aloud. Instead, they worked side by side, letting the doing speak for the dreaming. One afternoon in late November, Merritt returned from checking the snares with a fox pelt tucked beneath his arm. He smelled of cold bark and iron, and when Olive opened the door to let him in, he paused. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, boots still in the snow. She stepped aside, letting him in before the wind caught the fire. He crouched beside the stove, warming his hands before speaking again. "I had a letter waiting at the station when I went north. Took me a while to open it." Olive sat at the table, hands folded. "It was from my father. He sold the ranch, said he's headed east to live with my sister." She raised her brows slightly. "Did you answer him?" "No, but I think I will." His voice was quiet. "Not for his sake, for mine. I want him to know I made something better with my hands than he ever taught me." She looked at him for a long time before nodding. "Then write it. Tell him what you've built." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "I'll tell him about you too." The snow deepened. They rationed flour and sugar with care, but never went hungry. Merritt taught her how to read tracks in the snow, and she showed him how to knit by the firelight, her needles clicking steady while he read aloud from the old books they'd salvaged that fall. One brittle morning, Olive didn't rise with the sun. Her breath came shallow, her hand pressed low against her belly. Merritt wrapped her in blankets and fed the fire higher. "It's early," she whispered. He knelt beside her, taking her hand. "I'm here." The hours passed. The wind screamed against the shutters, but inside all was quiet but for her breath and the crackling of the fire. When the sun dipped low again, a cry broke the stillness, small and thin and new. Merritt's hands shook as he wrapped the child in cloth. Olive leaned back against the pillows, her face pale but her eyes clear. "It's a girl," he said, voice rough. She reached for the child. "Let me see her." He placed the baby in her arms, and Olive let out a soft sound Merritt had never heard from her before, deep and full and whole. They named her Clara. The days that followed turned slow and golden. Merritt sang low songs while chopping wood, and Olive hummed to Clara as she rocked her near the fire. The cabin, once filled with only the sounds of work and wind, now held the soft rhythm of a child's breath and the gentle language of new parents learning each other again, through the eyes of someone smaller. In December, Merritt rode into the nearby settlement with Clara bundled against his chest. Olive stayed behind to rest. When he returned, he carried a parcel wrapped in brown cloth and a slip of paper tucked beneath his coat. She met him at the door. "You've been gone longer than usual. There was a woman in town, a midwife. She'd heard of us, said she'd come help if needed." Olive raised a brow. "And the paper," he handed it to her. "Birth record, no law says we have to register it, but I want her to have it, proof she belongs here." She unfolded it. "Clara Oslen, born to Merritt and Olive Oslen, Salmon River Valley, Idaho Territory." Signed and sealed. "You gave her your name," Olive said, her voice catching. "I gave her ours." Years passed. The valley changed with each season, but the house remained, weathered and strong. Merritt built a second room off the back, and Olive planted a new garden each spring, Clara toddling barefoot between the rows. They never traveled far. They never needed to. The world they made was enough. And every winter, when the first snow fell, Merritt would draw Olive close by the fire, wrapping her hands in his, and she would rest her head on his shoulder, their daughter asleep in the next room, the hush of the land outside echoing the peace they'd built within. Together, they grew older. And together they stayed. A woman who had once fled in silence and a man who had once wandered without anchor, now rooted in a life of their own making, bound not by fear or rescue, but by choice, by trust, and by love that had taken its time and come home to stay.